Hi there, my name is Will. I am a video game developer, and for the last 2.5 or so years, I've been learning Japanese so I can delve even further into the medium. Lately, I've found myself wanting to make videos sharing my experiences, so I thought I would start with this game that I just finished, Gokinjo Boukentai, which you could roughly translate to Neighborhood Adventure Squad. I would probably translate it to something like Friendly Neighborhood Adventures. I'm just going to call it Gokinjo for the rest of the video. Anyway, Gokinjo was published for the Super Famicom in 1996. The game had many different hands on it, but chief among them was the game development studio ITL, which actually still exists to this day. Honestly, there's probably a lot you could say about the context that surrounds Gokinjo's development, but for now I'm just going to focus on the actual video game. In Gokinjo Boukentai, you play as Mana, a young girl who has just started her last year of preschool, and if that weren't exciting enough, she has also been enlisted by God to fight the forces of evil that are invading her town. During the adventure, she will enlist the help of several of her classmates, or I guess more like they will kind of just decide to be in her party. Mana is a silent protagonist, although I like the way that they handle it in Gokinjo. As far as we see as a player, she really only ever says hi or yeah, which are basically confirm or deny options, which is particularly funny when the question asked isn't actually a yes or no question. These combine with the very expressive portraits we get to see of her from time to time to create the sense that she's not devoid of personality, she's just a very quiet and polite girl. However, if you look at the instructions booklet, it's not 100% clear if that's the intended read or not. In the instructions booklet, she's definitely a little bit more vocal, so SNES RPG, whatever. What I find actually a little bit more interesting are her age and gender. It's pretty common to see kids as the main characters in video games from elementary school to like late high school, you know. But it's really uncommon to see like kindergartners be the protagonist of video games. And in particular, I've never seen a video game with a protagonist who is a kindergartner and a girl. I'm sure there must be another one, but nothing comes to mind, so. In this particular way, Gokinjo kind of ends up feeling particularly fresh. But of course, there are other things about this game that make it still feel fairly fresh compared to other RPGs, not only of the era, but even to this day. Chief among them is the school system, or the sort of raising mode, as it were. See, Gokinjo takes place in like late 80s, early 90s Japan, so for 6 days a week, the kids are going to school, and the only day they get off is Sunday. But of course, 6 days is a lot of time, so in the interest of not letting that time go to waste, we spend it on learning. In the raising mode, the choices that you make for your stats will influence the other portion of the game, not only in terms of influencing your actual RPG stats, but also making certain paths available to you. Certain events will only trigger if you reach a certain threshold, and this can include being able to meet certain party members. If you miss certain events, you will not be able to get certain party members, and so these stats are very important. But also, this format strikes me as interesting because it's very similar to Tokimeki Memorial, which is primarily known as a PS1 game. This would make this one of what I imagine is a very small number of Super Nintendo or Super Famicom games that were influenced by PS1 games. Much like Tokimeki Memorial, the week in Gokinjo is for building your character, and the weekend is for events, with events in Gokinjo essentially consisting of playing a traditional RPG, albeit with some wrinkles. For instance, compared to most RPGs where you earn money by winning fights, in Gokinjo you earn money largely from your allowance. You earn the allowance as part of the typical morning greeting that your mom does, where she wakes you up, she says, "Asa da yo, okinasai," which is basically just, it's morning, wake up. And then she gives you your allowance and maybe like a hint for what to do that day. And then you get dressed, and then you feed the fish, and then you go talk to your brother if he's home. And it kind of creates this sense of like there being like sort of a habit, which is really cool. I just like the fact that there's kind of like a sort of daily ritual that starts each Sunday. It adds to the sense that this is just kind of a normal life for this kid and not really like an adventure, right? The town too is very unique, I feel like, for an RPG. Like, for one thing, it's kind of just large for an RPG town of that era, but on top of that, it's also very alive. Like, every Sunday, NPCs will change in some way. Lots of them will have new dialogue, some of them will move out, some of them will move in, and for one thing, this is very economical, right? Obviously, like, they use the same town the whole game, so there's only one town they have to design, but in exchange for that, they get to kind of lean into some theming as well. Like, change is really important to the theming of this story, I think, and I'll dig into that more later, but for now, just remember, change, important. Anyway, obviously this would not be a traditional RPG without battles, so we do have some battles as well. In Gokinjo, the stats are pretty streamlined here. Like, we don't even have MP, it's just health, attack, defense, and speed. That's it. So like, okay, how do you cast spells then? Do you not have spells? No, you have spells, it's just that they cost health. And I really like that personally. I enjoy when RPGs trade out the typical MP system for something a little bit more different. Obviously, this is not the only RPG that makes health your MP resource, but it doesn't need to be the only one. This concept is used infrequently enough that a game doing it is enough to kind of help it feel fresh by itself. But it does come with some challenges, and at first I was a little bit worried about the direction the game was going mechanically, because one of the earliest skills you get is a skill that heals your entire party, right? It costs 30 health, and it heals 45 health, and enemies in this part of the game deal somewhere between 10 and 20 damage, and if you're doing the mental math, maybe you're starting to see the problem. Fortunately, the scaling does eventually make it so you can't just stall out fights and gamble on maybe being able to survive another turn so you can outdamage your opponent, but the early fights still feel very much like stat checks, basically, and this is kind of emphasized by the fact that there's a system where if you die, you can revive right back where you started, but you also get a stat boost in the set of your choosing between attack, defense, and speed, and that stat boost is permanent. Like, for the rest of the whole game, you get +6 in that stat for the rest of the game. And this will, like, definitely bring you back up to speed. This stat boost is pretty significant, and if you put it in defense, you'll probably not go down as fast. If you put it in attack, you'll probably nuke whoever you're fighting. Like, in a sense, it's kind of a basic version of adaptive difficulty, right? Like, oh, you're a little bit behind the curve, so here, get a boost in this stat, and now you'll be on the curve again. And that and other kind of similar choices make Gokinjo feel a little bit more modern than the console it's on would suggest. But at the same time, like, it needs to have this system because your stats are based on your character building from the schooling half of the game, right? And because you can only have one save at a time, you could probably get into a situation where you build your character poorly enough that you can't progress at all. Because there's no way to grind in this game, you don't get any experience from fights at all. So this feature kind of does double duty as a way to prevent the game from getting soft-locked, while also making it more accessible to younger audiences. The game does also, in the credit sequence, invite you to try playing through the whole thing without using this feature, but if you avoid using the special training mode, you also lose out on the ability to restart a fight from the beginning of it. You have to go back to your last save, and saves in Gokinjo are not super infrequent, but they're infrequent enough that it would definitely be a pain if you lost, like, at a boss fight or something, which is the most likely place for you to lose, right? And in Gokinjo, enemies can get attacks of opportunity, and if your player character goes down, you immediately game over. So with a really, really unlucky first turn, you could ostensibly just lose a fight instantly, and that's it, you couldn't have stopped it. So like, whatever, I'm not going for the challenge run, juice me up. I will say around the middle portion of the game is kind of where the battle system is at its best. A lot of fights feel kind of close. You do have to kind of swap up your strategies relatively often, especially for boss fights. Although you will be using your all-target spells very, very frequently, and a lot of fights will end in like 1 or 2 turns because mana is a monster. But then, like, for some reason, the game gets easier in like the back third or quarter or so. I don't know why, like, enemy health values just don't seem like they scaled as well as they needed to, and it gets even worse when the last party member enters the group because of a system that I haven't really talked much about yet. Essentially, when you're in a fight, you can change the orientation of your party, and this actually grants certain bonuses and detriments to your stats. And like, maybe this is just because I stuck with a specific party type because I missed one of the characters that I could have unlocked, but you spend most of the game kind of just sticking to one specific rotation because the other 2 rotations with the like most default party are bad. They're just straight up worse than the default. Like, there's no reason to pick them at all. I'm not really sure. Like, look at this. What am I supposed to do with that? That's worse. And then you get the final party member and you start getting buffs that look like this, and it's just like, okay, I guess I just win the rest of the fights forever now. But overall, it's not that bad. I would say it probably shakes out to be about as good or slightly better than an average RPG from the era, and the game's lowish overall length kind of prevents it from overstaying its welcome too much, I think. Before I wrap up talking about the battle system though, there is one last thing I would like to address, which is the ability to end fights immediately by talking to the enemy. This is something that's kind of an inconsistent as an option. It tends to work better based on the enemy's mood, so you'll see like a little description of their mood when the fight first starts, and based on that, your success rate will vary in terms of getting a monster to give up and just let you move on. And for this game it kind of makes sense because like there's no experience and you don't get money from fighting enemies. You do get some drops, but those drops are not like critically meaningful. I can kind of see it from a perspective of not wanting to have the little baby game encourage violence as a solution to every single problem, but unfortunately it's not super consistent, and there are lots of fights where it's just simply not an option at all. And in fact, a lot of the time if you try it, because of the issue I mentioned before, where fights can go south in just a single turn, it's not super safe as an option. There are cases where you won't convince an enemy to end the fight, but at the very least they won't attack you, so it'll come out neutral. But there are times where if you fail, the enemy will just attack you immediately. And so it's basically like they got an attack of opportunity, which ideally you would prefer to avoid altogether. So the option isn't super viable. There are only specific situations where you might want to try to lean on it, and it is funny when you try it on a boss fight and you just skip the boss fight. But overall, it feels a little bit undercooked. It feels lacking in depth. It doesn't even interface with the school system at all. You've got the stats, conversation, charm, and wisdom, but none of those have any impact on this system at all. It is funny, though, that like in 1996, an Earthbound-inspired RPG would make a mechanic where you can end fights with non-violence, and like almost 20 years later, another much more high-profile Earthbound-inspired RPG would go on to take the same concept and go much further with it. Anyway, that's really all I have to say about that. I guess next up would be the dungeons, which sure are dungeons. Sometimes you solve little tiny puzzles, but mostly they are just a means of funneling you through fights that offer a change of scenery. That's about it. And for what it's worth, they actually do a pretty decent job of that. They often come with their own unique music track. The tile set is completely different. Sometimes, rarely, but sometimes they'll even have a unique navigational gimmick. As far as puzzles go, though, there's really only like a handful, and most of them are at the very end of the game. And one of them is this good in concept, but really awful to actually play puzzle, where you have to guide an enemy onto a button, but the enemies move so fast when they latch onto you that it's really hard to actually pull this off without getting into the encounter. And like, okay, this is kind of on me. I forgot that I had a run button, so every time I got into the encounter, I would just fight the whole thing out, and that wasn't so fun. But I did forget I had a run button, but also it's never useful, but also I did forget, so regardless, the dungeons are still good at keeping things fresh, which is good because the town is actually where the vast majority of the events take place. This too kind of makes sense. It makes sense to have the player go back and forth across town and encounter new NPCs that may be there, or encounter new dialogue from old NPCs. Again, the town changes a lot, so it makes sense to enable the player to perceive that change. The player will gradually grow more familiar with the town. They'll become better at navigating it. They'll get a sense for where everybody lives, which they will need to, because the overwhelming majority of objectives that occur within the town require you to go to someone's house, and oftentimes the game kind of already expects you to know where they live. Granted, the instructions booklet does include like 2 maps to help you out with this, but if you don't think to check it, like I didn't, because I didn't realize that I could find the instructions booklet online, then that might be a little trickier. Even without that though, there are still some cases here and there where the navigation feels a little funky. Like, there were a number of times where I was like, I'm not sure where the game wants me to go. It's just that not realizing that the person had a house that I could go to, or where that house was, definitely made things a little harder. Other than that, I kind of just wish that whenever you hit a screen boundary, the game didn't have to slowly scroll over. That definitely hurts the pace a little bit and makes exploring the town, which you have to do a lot of, just kind of obnoxious. Still, overall, I really like this town. I really like the way that it's used. I think it serves the game's themes really well. And as long as I'm talking about the themes, let's talk about the tone in kind of broader terms. I imagine that a lot of people who see this game and or hear it probably would kind of associate it with Earthbound. I feel like that comparison is made pretty readily. I don't necessarily think it's super accurate in terms of the exact tone or the mechanics, but they are both definitely very silly games. And the lead artist for Gokinjo has specifically gone on record as saying that one of her favorite games of all time is Earthbound. So there is that. But Earthbound kind of believes in its depiction of its world. It's kind of grounded in that sense, where everything really is happening. The world really does exist as it is, and I feel like Earthbound wields its tonal contrasts in a different way. In Gokinjo, everything works on cartoon logic. Like, it's not really super clear whether or not the things that you play are actually occurring or not, or if that's just Mana and her friends playing pretend. Because, like, yes, the kids have superpowers, but so do the adults. The teacher Falcon punches a rock at one point, and Mana's mom has the uncanny ability of finding her no matter where her and her friends go, up to and including punching through a wall twice. And like, on that note, by the way, this game is really, really funny. It had me laugh out loud several times. It's kind of hard to illustrate this through just one video in which I'm not putting in the effort to translate every single line of dialogue on screen, but even without that, the physical comedy is still really good. And the game does lean really heavily into this. The overwhelming majority of scenarios in the game are comical. But the game is not without some more somber moments, and in order to talk a little bit more about those, I am going to have to spoil things. So if you would like to avoid those spoilers in the event of maybe one day someone actually translates the thing, or maybe you decide to learn Japanese or you're already learning Japanese and you want to try out the game, either way, I will include a little thing to navigate to where the spoilers stop. I'm gonna give like 3 more seconds for anyone who's listening to this on their phone and needs like time to dig out their phone and stop the video. Okay, anyway, near the end of August, in the middle of the night, Mana wakes up and goes downstairs to find her parents talking about how they'll have to move out. Her dad's been transferred and specifically notes there's nothing he can do about it. And this is where I feel the game's themes are at their strongest. I mentioned how I feel that this game is, at least in some part, about change, but also, to a large degree, how we can do nothing to stop it, a lot of the time. Mana is a kindergartner. She can hardly affect any change on her trajectory in life right now. But even her parents, the adults here, can't actually do anything to stop this situation from occurring. Change happens. We won't always understand why, and we can't always prevent it. I admit I might be reading into things a little bit too much here, but I feel like the adventure that occurs in this game is kind of Mana's way of coping with the fact that she can't really change things in a big way, but she can save the town in this adventure that she's on with her friends. Part of what makes me feel this way, other than what I mentioned before about how I'm not really sure whether or not the events of it are even real, is 2 things, actually. One is that her father explicitly mentions that her and her brother had just started getting used to the town, which suggests that they've had to do this before. And also, after this plot development occurs, Mana's mom's tone starts to change whenever she picks up Mana at the end of a day. Like previously, she would kind of scold her, kind of half-jokingly, but near the end of the game, she's more cheering for her, playing along, still urging her to go home and eat dinner, but her tone definitely feels much more gentle. But yeah, we can't control the change that occurs around us, but we can try to be the best that we can be, whether that's at school, or with our friends, or with the people around us. I think that those two things together are what Gokinjo is about. I'm not 100% sure, but that's kind of the impression that I get. I will grant, though, that as far as Japanese learning goes, I'm kind of like upper intermediate at best. Speaking of Japanese learning, I do want to talk just a little bit about the game's complexity from that perspective. It's surprisingly difficult. The game is in all kana, so if you're not familiar with how Japanese writing works, there are 3 character systems, right? Hiragana, katakana, kanji. The first 2 are phonetic, and the last one is a bunch of pictures, like thousands of them. Which might sound kind of daunting, and yes, it is pretty time-consuming to learn all that kanji. However, because of the sheer number of homophones in Japanese, as well as the grammar structure, if you even have a decent grasp of kanji, it'll be much harder not to have it. On top of that, because Gokinjo is set in kind of a late 80s, early 90s Japan, there are references to Japanese culture that are very difficult to Google. Like, one of the references is to a late 80s 7-Eleven ad. Overall, not a super hard read, but I'm glad that I waited as long as I did to try it. Anyway, what else is there? The music's really good. Like, as a composer, I feel like I should have more to say, but I don't know, it keeps the energy going really well. The main battle theme in particular has a really unique energy for a Super Famicom RPG, and continues to feel good to listen to for the duration of the game. There's also some good use of leitmotif to help the soundtrack feel more cohesive and also more memorable. I could always wish for a little more musical variety when it comes to Super NES games, but if I had to specifically say one thing that I would have liked to see, it probably would have been a change of music for the town for the last day. Otherwise, I think the town theme is cool. I like how it captures the sense of being in a residential area. Vaguely, I kind of wish that the sounds that they used for that song were a little bit more in time with the music, because the novelty of it does kind of wear off over the course of the entire video game, but that's sort of just my taste as a composer. As for the art, it's great. I mentioned before that Mana gets some very expressive portraits, but really everyone is really expressive in this game. Both in their portraits and also during the class periods, you can see a whole variety of expressions in both the success and failure states. It's very fun to see all the different ways that characters react. On top of that, the illustrations that you can find in the instructions booklet are also adorable. They include some comic panels, which you can definitely tell that this was drawn by a manga artist, and indeed Masumi Sudo, who is a manga artist, is largely responsible for a lot of the game's style. As it happens, Yuzu, the orange cat in this game, also appears in some of Sudo's other work as well. Other than that, the fact that Mana's mom and dad are constantly working is really interesting. That also kind of helps ground the setting. Honestly, there's so much I could talk about here. I started noticing, actually, that the longer I went on, the louder and more high-pitched my voice got. And that's just how I feel talking about this game. It's so nice to play a video game that it's not even necessarily good. It is good, but that's not the point so much as the fact that it's interesting. There's a lot to be said about it. I wish I had as many things to say about most RPGs as I do about Gokinjo. Anyway, I could probably go on and on, but I think I'll stop here. I've said what I really want to say for now anyway. Really, I would love to make one of those abridged Let's Plays that are really popular on YouTube nowadays, but if I aimed for that, this video would never get done. As it turns out, making video games and learning Japanese, and also leaving enough time between those two things that you don't completely lose your marbles, doesn't leave very much time for other things. And I've really been wanting to share my thoughts, and so I'm kind of going for like a sort of lower effort version. This video still took days to make because I kind of went for a ramble style, but I'm not used to recording anymore. There's a whole bunch of stuff I need to relearn, and I need to unlearn my perfectionism for every single take. Anyway, thank you for watching, or maybe just listening. If you'd like to see more of my videos in the future, you know what to do. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope to see you again. Later.